I'm going to just go through a number of slides. My intent for today is to give you sort of a hybrid snapshot and update of our program. One, to go over a little bit about our regulatory framework, to give you an update on where we are in the process of implementing our new program. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into alternatives analysis, California style, compare that a little to IC2's approach, and talk a little bit about our CalSafer portal, which is we've been working hard on. So that's the main framework. Basically, I know many of you are familiar that the California Safer Consumer Products Program is implementing regulations that were finalized in 2013 at the behest of our California legislature. And the regulations are really divided into four key components. The first part being identifying specific chemicals of concern, which we call candidate chemicals. The second part of the process is identifying specific consumer products that contain one or more of those chemicals. The third part is requiring that the manufacturers of those products, which we call priority products, do an alternatives analysis. And the fourth part is sort of the checks and balance on the process, where DTSC has the ability to impose what we call regulatory responses once you look at that alternatives analysis. I'm going to go in a little bit more depth of that just to tell you what each of these is about. The first part is identifying candidate chemicals. And what we did was we looked at 23 other lists throughout the world that were established by other regulatory bodies, some here in California, like the Prop 65 list, other lists like EPA's IARC and whatnot, that identify specific chemicals because of their hazard trait. We also adopted some lists that we call exposure lists, because they're really on there because they're lists of chemicals that are found either in people or in the environment. And those lists we brought in by regulation, by reference. There's 23 of them, and there's about 2,000 plus chemicals on that list. The next stage of the process is us taking those chemicals and looking at consumer products that contain one or more of those chemicals and saying which one of these are ones we want to tee up to be the focus of our program and the requirements for doing AA. So the way we do that is that we have a rotating 3-year work plan that identifies product categories from which we pick specific products. We take that product chemical combination that we call a priority product, we put it in rulemaking, and once that's established in this listing regulation, those people who make that product are then what we call responsible entities and are then subject to our alternatives analysis process, which is essentially a 2-stage process. And I'm going to go into that in more detail, that really shifts the burden onto the manufacturer to do the heavy lifting of analysis that says, is this chemical necessary? Are there safer alternatives? We want to make sure we avoid regrettable substitutions, and how can we make our product safer? And then ultimately, the department looks at that analysis and either approves it, saying, go forth, do good things, or we say, well, you know, you're a little short on something. You need to do something in addition to what you're proposing, which might mean that you need to provide us or the public with information. You might need to do some additional research or fund research. You might need to put in place an end-of-life management system for product stewardship if your product poses risk at the end of life. And ultimately, we can restrict or ban the sale of that product if necessary. So that's it in a nutshell. So I'm going to go through a little update on each one of these processes or where we are. There's the citation if you're interested and go to read the details. So on our candidate chemical list, as I said, we pulled in 23 different lists from all over the world. Those lists are, with a couple of exceptions, are living and breathing. They change routinely, some faster than others. But as they change, our list changes in real time here in California. So we, every quarter, update that list. We have an informational candidate chemical list that's available on CalSafer. I'll talk about that later, that you can search, that identifies each specific chemical, which hazard trait or traits that it exhibits, and which list we pulled it from. So currently, just wanted to highlight that we are in the process of rulemaking to change that list a little, because we made a mistake in our first regulations, which inappropriately pointed to some lists that didn't exist. So we're correcting that to make sure that we're pointing to the EU's substance of very high concern list for endocrine disruptors, And we also are updating one of the reports, the HHS Toxicity Program report on carcinogens, from the 12th to the 13th report, because that's a static list. It doesn't change on its own. So we're in the process of updating those lists. There's not a big change in the scope of chemicals. There's only about 3 chemicals that will be added, because many of the chemicals are on multiple lists. So one might drop off one list, but still on another list. It's still in our realm. So the next part of the process is identifying what we call a priority product. And I wanted to highlight that our criteria for doing that are pretty broad, and there's 2 main things. One is that we identify a product that has a chemical on our chemicals list for which there is potential exposure to that chemical to people or the environment, and that exposure has the potential to cause or contribute what we call significant or widespread adverse impact. So that's pretty broad criteria, and note that the word potential is in there, which is helpful because it is sometimes difficult to connect directly a potential adverse impact to a potential specific chemical exposure. But anyway, those are the criteria, and we've been working for the last 1.5 years on our first products to identify, and the ones we're going to be initially putting in regulation starting in 2016. There's 3 of them. They're all mouthfuls. Children's foam padded sleeping products containing the flame retardants TDCPP or TCEP. This will be a variety of kind of sub-products, including things like nap mats, portable cribs with padding, things like that. The basic concept being that children sleep on these things, that these flame retardants, which are potential carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, get out and into their bodies via dust. The second priority product here is paint strippers with methylene chloride. Methylene chloride is well documented in terms of its potential harm to people, including death, and there are alternatives. And the third product is spray polyurethane foam systems containing unreacted MDI. The focus of this is really protecting workers who spray insulation and roofing products containing MDI, and there's a limited number of manufacturers. Again, we're not concerned about the cured foam, but the process of spraying the foam when the polymerization takes place and potential exposures to MDI take place. So we'll be putting those into regulation the first part of this year, and then we start with those 3 specific products. They will be subject to our third part of our process, which is the alternatives analysis. Before I get to talk about AA in a little more detail, I wanted to talk about our work plan. In April of this year, we finalized our first priority product work plan, which is intended to send signals to all of our stakeholders about the categories of products that we're looking at as sources of the next set of priority products. Our work plan outlined 7 different categories, some of which are quite large. The first one is beauty, personal care, and hygiene products. And with some exceptions, all of these categories are looking at all of the chemicals on our list, and I'll highlight the ones that don't. But so you can imagine that some of these categories have hundreds, if not thousands, of products which contain potentially hundreds or more of potential candidate chemicals. The second categories are household, office furniture, and furnishings. In this category, we specifically identified that our concerns are really about chemicals that provide stain and water resistance and flame retardants. So we've narrowed this category to a smaller set of chemicals from our list. The third category, building products, we narrowed that category to look at certain kinds of products, specifically paints, adhesives, sealants, and floorings, which again, while that seems narrower, there's still a lot of products within that subcategory. Fourth, we have cleaning products. This covers a wide range of products, both in industrial and home use. Fifth, clothing, again, a broad category. And then we have 2 categories that are significantly narrower. Office machinery, consumable products is really focusing on 3 things: inks and toners that are used in copy machines and office machinery, and thermal receipts that are used, thermal paper is used for receipts. and that are treated typically with chemicals of concern. The last category, fishing and angling equipment, is really narrowly focused at small pieces of angling equipment such as fishing weights that contain lead. And the concern here is that some of those products are small and are ingested by waterfowl, which poisons them. So this is a pretty narrow category as well. So that's the lay of the land for what will be essentially our menu from which we'll pick the next set of priority products. So I included this slide. This is a slide from 2008, which is when our sponsoring legislation passed. And that's a photo of my oldest daughter, who at the time was 16 and who now is 23. And I asked her, I said, when we started thinking about personal care products, can you just like show me all the stuff you put on your body every day? And as you can see, there was a lot of it. And the personal care products industry is glad to know that she's still using a lot of it, but she is more aware of what she's putting on her body. But this is a big category. But I just thought I'd highlight that these are the kind of things that we are all concerned about, at the manufacturers, NGOs, government, as well as the things that we put on our children every day, and everyone wants them to be safe. So that's what we're trying to do, is find things that warrant alternatives analysis. One of the key things in our work plan that we identified is sort of what we call our policy priorities. One of the questions that we've often been asked and continue to be asked is, well, how are you deciding which products to pick? So what we laid out were these policies that are going to be the guides and filters for how we make decisions about the next set of products. And these are simply really identifying that we want to make sure that the chemicals we pick, that we are clear, and when we look at a product chemical combination, that there's a clear exposure pathway to that chemical of concern, either to the people or the environment. That we're going to use biomonitoring results as best we can to show that there's potential for exposure to people. We're going to look at indoor air monitoring because we know that people spend a large amount of time indoors, and so we'll be looking to that data to support decision making about what we focus on. We're going to specifically look with more interest at children and workers, because children, because of developmentally they're susceptible to some chemicals and at greater risk, and workers because of their extended exposure profiles to certain chemicals. And lastly, the first three products we're looking at are really human health concerns. So our program is also concerned about environmental and eco impacts. So we were also going to be looking at water quality monitoring evidence to find chemicals that might be in our environment and that have potential adverse impacts on aquatic resources. So this is some of the filters we'll be using to decide what we focus on next. And it's an iterative process. We don't have any silver bullet criteria. It's a narrative criteria. You know, we're looking for things that have exposure and cause potential significant or widespread harm. So we're looking at the list of chemicals. We're looking in those categories that we've identified, the 7 categories. And we're seeing, we're working at this from many angles and doing research both in academic literature, talking to industry, talking to NGOs and advocacy groups about concerns, collecting data, and seeing, as we sift through in an iterative process, what's going to rise to the top. We will be, in the next year, doing more public engagement when we start narrowing these categories and having discussion, because what we found, certainly with our first 3 products, is that once you put something out there specifically, a lot of information comes out that you weren't aware of, that might not have been in the public domain, or when you can start having a more substantive and detailed conversation with the manufacturers in particular, you learn a lot about the specific chemical nature of the products, their specs they need for performance, and alternatives as well. So that's the process we'll go about for choosing the next set of products. But before then, the first set of products and subsequent products will be, getting to the key kind of core part of our regulatory framework, which is doing the AA. And really, I think you've heard us talk for the last couple of years about asking this question, is it necessary? Well, the AA is how you answer that question. And you start looking at the trade-offs and what data do you have or not have? What are the specific criteria that you need for performance for a product, and what's its functional use and needs? And then what are the alternatives? So that's really the core. Then I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about our framework for AA and our guidance that we're developing on how to get through it. So essentially, one of the key things about our AA process is that, and this is something that causes great discomfort in some sense for some of the people who might be subject to the rule, is that it's really a narrative standard. It's not a step-by-step A plus B equals C process. There's a lot of criteria that have to be considered, and there has to be a lot of decision-making done by the practitioner of the AA. And it's done both across the whole life cycle of the product, and we require transparency of information. Show your work. So what are we doing with that right now? Where are we in the process? We just completed the first round of our Stage 1 guide, which is really designed to help people get through the process of conducting AAs pursuant to our regulations and their requirements. We had a public comment period. We did a couple of webinars. We have a green ribbon science panel, which is made up of a myriad of folks, both from industry, academia, NGO, health, who's given us some input on the process. And we'll be taking the comments we got, wrapping those into the second stage guidance, which will be coming out in the first quarter of 2016, hoping to finalize the whole thing in the spring of 2016, so it'll be done before we actually adopt any of the priority products in regulation and before anyone is actually required to perform an AA here in California. So I'm going to talk a little bit in more depth about our AA process. This is a little fuzzy slide, but essentially the key things I wanted to highlight in this messy slide are that there's two stages in the AA report. The first one is more of a screening stage and requires that the responsible entity give us a work plan and that we approve that work plan and move forward into the second stage, which is a deeper dive about decision making and looking at alternatives. A couple of key things. In the upper right hand corner of this, you see there are other AA options. What that means is that in our regulations, we provide a variety of avenues that people can go. They can do the standard AA as we lay out. They can do what we call an abridged AA, which means that they've already done a lot of work. They don't feel there's a great alternative, and they're willing to go right to the regulatory response piece of the regulations, which then says what are we going to do to further either closing data gaps or making specific measures for education or restriction of sales. That's one path that can be gone down. We also provide that someone could submit to us a proposal for an alternative AA process, so long as they're meeting the basic requirements of our regulations. They may have a process in place that's very similar that needs to be tweaked. And the other thing which is key is that people can use previously completed alternatives analyses. And much as the IC2 AA is trying to populate, and we're hoping to keep populating AAs as they're developed so people can see them and use them, within our regulations we allow that people can collaborate, conduct an AA together, use previous AAs. We don't want people to reinvent the wheel or spend money that could be better spent by pointing to something that was done well previously. So the other element I wanted to highlight is that our AAs, a key part of this is transparency of information. While we do and we will protect legitimate trade secret and confidential business information, everything else will be very public. All the alternatives analysis will be posted on our web page in our CalSafer site. People will be able to look at them. The regulations provide a public comment period, and then we'll look at those and decide if the responsible entity needs to respond to any of those comments. So it's a very public vetting of the AA process and ultimately the department will then decide if there's a regulatory response that's needed. And that's a small slide with lots of layers of requirements and regulations. The basic concept being it's an iterative process, it's a public process, and we will be relying on good work done by the practitioner, the QA/QC that will come from public vetting of that, and ultimately decision making on our part. A little bit about our guidance document to make sure that people understand what it is and what it isn't. It is guidance, it's not regulations. We got some feedback, obviously, that some people would really like us to just tell them how to do it. What do I do when? How do I do it? And the guide is not really that. It's more of a toolbox that provides information on tools, approaches, concepts that can be used in going through the regulatory requirements, but we don't tell you exactly how to do it when. Also, the guide is really designed to be what we call dynamic. It's not going to be a one and done guide. As we go through the process, as AAs get completed, as we learn of additional tools and approaches, we will amend and append the guide to make that a living document, and hopefully continue to be more and more helpful. It's really not designed to be a step-by-step guide for one entity or one priority product. It's going to be a cookbook that people will be able to use for their specific needs. And again, it's just not a checklist. It's not that the nature of it isn't that, oh, if I do all these things, then I'm good. You have to know all these things. You have to come up with a work plan. You have to decide what's relevant and appropriate, and then make decisions based on that. So again, we appreciate that everyone wants to be in compliance. This is a regulatory program that will have potential enforcement implications, but it really is changing the dialogue from a standard environmental or health program that has a numeric or fixed standard that you have to meet to a narrative standard, so that you're going to have to show your work, make your argument of why what you put together is appropriate. And that causes, understandably, concern because there's a fair amount of uncertainty in that process. So the guidance document really, thankfully, looked at all these great other models and tools that have been developed, and we used what we could based on the requirements in our statute and regulations. I note the IC2 guide, of which two of our lead staff, Nancy Ostrom and Bob Boughton, participated in IC2 guide development, and we benefited greatly from that. I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about how we're similar and different from that guide, but we also looked at other models throughout the world. A few key things about California's AA process. One is that our regulations specify a multitude of specific factors that must be considered in conducting an AA. And the important thing is that they have to be considered and evaluated. They may not all be a deep dive on them, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. We also require that economic impacts are assessed in detail, including public and environmental health costs and costs to government and nonprofits, and monetizing those costs as best as you can. It's also a perspective that we're not just looking at the use phase. We're looking at the life cycle approach to that product, from cradle to grave, from extraction, production, transportation, use, and ultimately end of life. This creates, on one hand, a lot more things to consider and potential challenges in collecting data, but it's really meant to ensure that options are looked at, and when we look at alternatives, that we don't shift impacts to a different media or a different stakeholder, and that we don't create regrettable substitutions or have a net negative benefit to change. Again, we're also not just looking at chemical substitution, but the whole design, which might include engineering controls or engineering changes. But we don't require in the AA process that anyone generate new data. So again, depending on the product and the chemical, there are often going to be some significant data gaps that will have to be addressed. So specifically comparing California's approach to alternatives analysis and the IC2 AA, which I thought would be maybe interesting for this group, is that, of course, the biggest difference is that we have a regulatory program that has specific requirements. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, it's a very different regulatory program in that we don't have a numeric standard generally. We're talking a narrative standard and a process that people have to go through. People could use our process or mirror our process voluntarily, certainly, but as I highlighted, we will be picking specific products, what we call priority products, and those people who, if you sell that product into California, you will be required to conduct an AA. And that comes with a lot of other impacts. So the other thing is we require that life cycle thinking be used, and that the analysis look at life cycle analysis throughout the life cycle of the product. IC2, that module is a recommended module, but it's not required to go through the IC2 process. Again, our scope is very broad because IC2 focuses primarily on safer chemicals, and our process, while you get into the process through safer chemicals, we also are looking at the way you improve your product may include other things besides chemical substitution or safer chemicals, such as design changes. Yeah, another interesting thing is that, you know, I think the framework for IC2 guide is largely driven by human health as a priority, and our process accounts for both human and environmental impacts. We have a lot of discretion on what we pick, which obviously will impact the potential harm depending on the product and the chemical, or both. But they're mostly, I want to highlight that notwithstanding those significant differences, that fundamentally there are mostly similarities. There is a bias towards looking at hazard first and trying to reduce hazard, thereby reducing risk by definition. Certainly we both take into account exposure, and thus risk comes into play. But the nature of the beast is that our belief is that if you first start with hazard, that you're going to be not dependent on engineering controls or human action to protect people from risk. Secondly, transparency is a key part of both of our processes, IC2 and California's. I put a plus next to California because, as I highlighted earlier, that when AAs are completed in California, they are subject to public comment, and we, DTSC, will decide which of those comments might need to be addressed by the practitioner or the responsible entity. And I think just the fact that the great thing about transparency is that it has its own energy, in that by daylighting data and analysis and decision making, you get better decisions across the board. And lastly, flexibility. While IC2 guide basically says you need to do the first 4 modules, there's a lot of flexibility within those, and to add additional factors of concern. Some might argue that California's process isn't that flexible because we require so much, both in terms of the whole life cycle and the number of factors that must be considered. And yet, I would argue that yes, there's a lot on the plate, but you have a lot of flexibility to determine what is relevant and what makes sense. So a lot more in common than different. Just a quick first stage AA snapshot is that really focuses on looking at what the product requirements and known alternatives might be, identifying relevant factors, starting impact assessment, and screening alternatives. I want to stress, though, that it's an iterative process, and that as you get into the second stage, which is a deeper dive on exposure assessment, LCA, economics, and alternatives comparison, is that you will most likely find information that might raise a question that you'd screened out in stage 1, that you need to go back and look at that based on what you learned. So while it's formally 2 stages, collectively it's a dynamic kind of thing. I wanted to touch on a few key perspectives and approaches in our framework. One is this issue of relevant factors, which is key in our AA process. And a relevant factor is really defined in two ways. It's something that both makes a material contribution to an impact on people or the environment, and a material difference when compared to a specific alternative. And so I'm going to pull that apart a little bit. It's a little confusing, and when you read it in the regulations, it's a little obtuse, but as you start looking in practice, it makes more sense. So just to use an example we've used before, if you're looking at CO2 emissions, you might look at a specific product that in the use phase, when you're comparing your product to an alternative, you look at the alternative and maybe it produces twice as much CO2 during the use phase. Well, when we look at that, we would say, well, is that material? And what we would say is, well, that's certainly, there's a material difference between CO2 emissions in this phase. But then if you go on and you go and you say, well, is there a material contribution overall of CO2 between your product and the alternative you're looking at? When you look across the life cycle, you might see that, well, in fact, in total, the significance of the CO2 emissions in the use phase is trivial. And in this case, you might then determine that there's not a material contribution to when comparing your product and the alternative that you're looking at. So you might not, that might end it there. On the other hand, you might find that, wow, in fact, that is significant across the board, and you do need to consider it, and that factor is relevant. The part of the challenge in the California system is that we have a wide range of factors that must be considered. And what's on this slide is really looking at those as outlined in our statute and regulation. And these are fairly straightforward: environmental impacts, public health, end of life, waste, environmental fate, physiochemical properties, etc. But what that means is that when you start pulling apart in our regulation is that there are a lot of layers to each one of these factors. And I'll just highlight one. If you're talking about adverse environmental impacts, what that means in California is that there are very specific factors you need to consider. And there are layers of this. So you're looking at air impacts, eco impacts, soil, and water. And when you start breaking that down, there are specific things you have to consider, such as California air, toxic air contaminants, which are specific and under greenhouse gases, and NOx, SOx, etc. You also need to look at things like water impacts, and there are very specific criteria that need to be addressed. Now, not all of these certainly may be relevant, but you need to go through this exercise of thinking on this menu of impacts, are these things that might be a relevant factor? Is there a material difference between an alternative I might consider, and is that material difference contribute to the overall impact? So this is just the environmental impacts. Each one of these has these layers, and so there are a multitude of things that have to be considered. This is some of the feedback we've gotten from some concern about the breadth of this program, and understandably there's a lot on the plate here, but this is where we'll be working with people to help them understand what is a relevant factor, and tell us your story in your AA. Explain what you looked at, what your assessment was, why you made the decision you did. And the second stage really gets even in more depth in terms of relative to the function and performance of the specific priority product and economic impacts. So before going to CalSAFER, I just want to say that we're building this process both in regulation and in guidance. We haven't done it before, and much as the community of practice in AA is learning, we are learning too. And we certainly would appreciate your input. Although the comment period is closed on our guide, if you have a perspective you think would be helpful for us, or you have strong opinion about it, send me an email, let us know. We really appreciate that. And this will really start, the AA process in California will really start taking greater shape once we get those first products listed in regulation and the clock starts. Okay, I wanted to just highlight a little bit what we're doing in California, and terms of trying to manage data. As you know, IC2 is putting a lot of effort into, and a lot of great work being done by the IT work group. But what we've done in California is try to create a portal we call CalSafer, which gives people a few tools that make it easier to get through our process. One is we have a candidate chemical search tool. I talked earlier about our list of 2,000 plus chemicals. You can go into our CalSafer program, you can go to the candidate chemical database, and you can search by CAS number, by chemical name, and you can identify which chemicals are actually on our list. You can see which list they came from, or list, because many of them are from multiple lists. What are the hazard traits of concern? You can also then search those. You can also look at, you'll note on the bottom right highlighted thing is search potentially excluded candidate chemicals. Our overriding statute excludes things like pesticides and food products. Some of the lists that we brought in include some of those things, so we've taken them off of our candidate chemical list, but you can look and see what we've taken off. So it's a powerful tool to see both what chemicals are on our list, and if you're a manufacturer, for example, are any of the things you're using on our list. So that's, we hope, helpful. We update this quarterly. IC2, we're working together to ensure that the list that's on IC2 website is just a reflection of this list, and we'll hopefully make that as seamless as possible. So check that out. Also, CalSafer is an opportunity and a tool to allow people to give us input. So we'll use that both for when we've asked for comments on our Stage 1 AA guide and our current rulemaking and subsequent rulemakings. You'll be able to either just send us a blurb, a comment, or attach documents that then will all be sortable by everyone publicly. When we get to the AA process, AAs will be submitted into CalSafer. They'll be searchable. There'll be redacted versions that will protect CVI and trade secret information. But it's also a good tool for us because as we anticipate many comments on our rulemaking, we can then internally sort them as well because we're required to answer all of those comments in the rulemaking process. So CalSafer is a good tool. So I'm going to wrap it up here so we can have some questions, but essentially, as we build and implement our process, we're really focusing on a few things. We've got the chemical identification process pretty well down. We've got our first few products teed up. We have a work plan trying to identify the next set of priority products we want to focus on. And we're working on our AA process and developing guidance on how we can work with people in doing AAs. And I want to stress also that once that process starts, we'll be working very publicly with trade organizations, with NGOs and advocacy groups on these issues in a very transparent way. So hopefully this will be helpful for everyone. But there's a lot of decision making that's coming down the road, both for us, what we focus on, and for people who are regulated by us. And we hope to continue to work with IC2 and build both the ability to share information and understanding and learnings so that everyone, whether you're in California doing an AA or doing one of your voluntary nature in another state, that we have the best processes, best science, and most wisdom available. So that's kind of what we're doing. Now we got plenty of time for questions, I think, and here's my contact information. Thanks for your interest and support. Topher, back to you.
Yes, Karl, thank you so much. So I'm going to sort of run through here and basically unmute everybody that I can, and then we will just go ahead and let people ask questions if you have any. So I've been able to unmute everybody, but Josh and Carrie, you'll have to unmute yourselves, I think, if you want to speak up. But so
let me just throw in, Topher. Can you everyone hear me?
Yeah.
We're also hiring. We're able to get a few more bodies this year, and hopefully maybe next year or so. If you're interested in coming to California, send me an email.
great, good to know. And I will also just, Karl basically referenced this, but in case not everyone on the call knows, we do have the candidate chemicals list in the IC2 State Chemicals of Concern database. So, it doesn't necessarily have all the same search functionality that CalSafer does. CalSafer is a very nice system. The one thing that having it in our IC2 database does allow you to see is, essentially chemicals that are listed by multiple states. So Washington, Vermont, Maine, California, and of course, coming soon, Oregon. So it's good resource if you're not familiar with it already. So, all right, questions for Karl?
Don't all talk at once. Someone's got to give me a hard one.
Okay, this is Rachel Massey at the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, and I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about what you are hoping that the regulated parties will accomplish with their economic analyses. And I guess in particular I'm wondering whether you're hoping that they'll focus primarily on their internal cost analyses, or whether they'll actually be comparing their internal costs to external cost to society. I know that they're supposed to look at both, but I just wonder if you could comment on kind of what ideally you'd like to see coming out of that part of the analysis.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. That's a good question. And I think part of it's going to depend on the specific product, and part of it's going to depend on the ability for people to get data and to figure out how to effectively monetize impacts, which is not something a lot of people are used to doing. But I think ideally, to answer your question, what we'll see is that when a company is looking at alternatives, I mean, we hear all the time as regulators that, well, regulations are bad, this is the impact, you're going to put us out of business, they're going to increase costs. But I think it's an opportunity to, when you look at all of those costs, to really balance out impact. Because, and this is one of the challenges we have in our system, is that because we have so many factors broadly, it begs the question, potentially, of the trade-off of impacts and values, for lack of a better word. So, for example, I use the CO2 gas example for relevant factors. Well, it would be interesting when the question arises, how do you account for or weigh or take into account the economic impact versus a benefit or cost, if you will, from toxicity, harm, or your business? And I don't know. I mean, I think this is one of those big questions. It's going to be interesting to see how people approach it. And I think I would say is that certainly some have voiced concern that because the broad nature of all these factors is that it might allow people to make arguments that that discount adverse impacts. And I think what I can say to that is that what we have, that's the nature of the process, is that we ultimately, DTSC, will have the responsibility to assess the AA, what they put forward, what data they use or didn't use, an analysis, and then make a determination of if it's adequate. And if it's not adequate, then we can go back and say, hey, you need to provide more data, or you're going to have to do something differently to account for that negative impact. But I think it's a great question. We're in the process of the second stage guidance will include, hopefully, some more information on approaches to dealing with the economic requirements. And we're in the process now of talking to a whole bunch of people about that. And if you have any suggestions or red flags, we'd love to get your input. So I didn't
Okay,
have a great
great.
answer,
Thank you.
but that's kind of where we are in thinking about it.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Other questions for Karl? Well, Karl, I certainly have one. You know, I think to me one of the things that's interesting about this and seems certainly to be challenging is given the nature of the regulatory process, the rate at which you, that is DTSC, are able to put forward or promulgate, I suppose is perhaps the right word, priority products. And are you optimistic that that as the program sort of evolves and you get more experience doing this, that you'll be able to do some of that a little faster? I mean, I know some of these things are sort of built in, into the regulatory framework and can't really be can't go faster than that. So,
it's a good question. I think certainly, all of these processes we're doing for the first time right now, and it's taken us. I'm frankly a little frustrated about the pace we've been able to get our first products out the door. It's been a year and a half since we actually said these are the things we want to look at. But I anticipate that once we get the first ones done, we've learned a lot in the last couple of years, and the pace will accelerate, I hope. That said, is that we are being very conscious not to make this about the number of things we do, but really trying to pick things that are going to be meaningful and impactful. And I think the next round of products will be really important in that regard, because I think we're going to, if you look at the first three products we had, you can argue that the nap mats isn't that huge of a deal because happily the manufacturers are voluntarily moving away from those flame retardants quickly. And spray foam is challenging because of the green chemistry challenges and lack of alternatives. And then methylene chloride is maybe the most quote unquote pure AA ready kind of question. The next ones will be very important too. So yeah, we're very aware that to make the program meaningful and viable, we both need to have a pace that's impactful, but we want to make sure we do it right rather than fast. And I wanted to circle back to Rachel's question a little and maybe give you an example, Rachel, at a more basic level of some of our thinking. An example, so to use the spray foam industry as an example, we've had extensive conversations with them about our concerns and their concerns, etc. One perspective might be is that the industry has said loud and clear, well, we spend an awful lot of time, energy, and money to protect our workers. That we use PPE, we do training, etc. And they have some very good programs established to do that. But part of the economic analysis, I would think, would be such that, well, if you actually were comparing a safer alternative that had a different kind of risk profile, you might be able to use something that didn't require as much PPE and training, which is a significant cost. So the trade, let alone any potential health impact costs that would be avoided. So there are at the macro level things that you could do to suggest that economic analysis would be interesting. So.
Karl, this is Terry. I have a question, or
Terry.
I think. So, I think that in this process, you're going to be sending some strong signals to these companies about these chemicals of concern and the products that have these chemicals. I guess I'm interested, do you all anticipate that, when you designate these things that, companies will, rather than go through this AA process, will endeavor to phase out their use of these chemicals and avoid this process, and which, I think would be in some ways problematic because you could then end up with some regrettable substitution. So I guess I'm interested in any thoughts about all of that experience that we've had with some of that happening.
Yeah, it's a very good issue. Certainly, we've had a lot of contact with folks, both from companies that are interested about what we might pick because they don't want to be picked, but also about companies that might want us to pick something because they think they have a safer alternative. So one aspect of this is that we have an important role when we pick to understand where that might push people, and positive and negative. So, and there, our list is fairly comprehensive of well-known chemicals with good data, but we're also aware that if we pick something that has alternative chemicals that are not on our list, that people might be able to move to something that potentially could be a regrettable substitute. So we're very cognizant of that responsibility. But it is, we see people are smart. They're seeing like, okay, whether it's the garment industry looking at their RSL lists and then looking at our lists, or on the other end of the spectrum, the chemical footprint process using our list is, people are saying these are things that you should be aware of, and we think that's a good thing. But yeah, the product selection is really important because we don't want to push people in the wrong direction, but we want to motivate people to do the right thing. So, and if people can get out from under us and do the right thing and not be subject to the process, great. I mean, the nap mats is a good example. We knew going in that a lot of people were moving away from using those flame retardants. We still are pursuing that because we think we know there are some other producers who are still using some of those products, and it might be a situation where the industry leaders are all out, and then we need to go pursue more compliance strategies with the laggards. But every industry is a little different, and products are different. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Karl? We've got just a couple of minutes here, so time for perhaps one more before we stop. All right. Well, and if not, that's certainly all right as well. I am going to, assuming everybody can see this, I just typically at this point in the presentation, aside from thanking the speaker, which I will do, and so thank you again, Karl, very much for this update. It's always good to hear.
Pleasure.
About what's going on. Typically at this point, of course, I'm then plugging our next webinars, and I will do that in a sort of general sense here, in that we don't have any firm schedule yet for calendar year 2016, but the training work group is certainly working on it, and we have a number of really great ideas and plans for webinars early in the new year. So please stay tuned for more information about that. And in the meantime, have a very happy holidays, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll talk with you soon. Thanks again, Karl.
Thanks, Topher. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.